What would you do if the perfect life you built was a lie? For Isabella Rossi. She had it all, a loving marriage to the brilliant billionaire Damien Blackwood, and a child on the way. She was living a fairy tale. But one discovery, a single piece of paper, revealed a crack in her perfect world. A secret so devastating it would not only destroy her marriage, but tear her entire family apart. Today we're telling the story of the day she risked everything. Her reputation, her safety, her unborn child, to expose the truth in the most public way imaginable. Because the other woman wasn't a stranger. It was her own sister. The pain came first, a low, insistent throb in her lower back, a familiar torment in the 7th month of a high-risk pregnancy. Isabella Rossi Blackwood pressed a hand to the small of her back, the 5-carat diamond on her finger, catching the morning light that streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of her London penthouse. Below the Thames snaked its way through the city, a murky brown ribbon tying together a kingdom of glass and steel. It was a kingdom she was queen of, yet she had never felt more like a prisoner. Her husband, Damien Blackwood, was a king of his own making, a titan of industry, whose company, Blackwood Industries, was less a business and more a global force. He moved markets with a single phone call and dismantled competitors with a quiet, ruthless efficiency that both terrified and thrilled the financial world. He was handsome, chiseled by late nights and early mornings into a sculpture of ambition. He had wooed Isabella with the same intensity he applied to a corporate takeover, relentless, charming, and utterly convincing. She had fallen, and for 5 years their life had been a meticulously curated dream. Dinners in Paris, weekends in Monaco, charity galas where her name was whispered with the same reverence as his. She was the perfect accessory, elegant, intelligent, the old money grace to his new money power. The Rossi name, steeped in Italian aristocracy and quiet wealth, had given him the one thing he couldn't buy: legitimacy. And now she was giving him an heir, a son, the final piece of the Blackwood dynasty. The back pain sharpened, and Isabella winced, sinking into a plush velvet armchair that cost more than most people's cars. She reached for the silver water pitcher on the marble side table, her movements slow and deliberate. It was in these quiet moments, when the city hummed below and the vast, empty penthouse echoed with ululance, that the whispers of doubt began. For the past 6 months, Damien had been distant. Not cold, not cruel, but absent in a way that felt more profound than his frequent business trips. He was a ghost in their bed, leaving before she woke his scent on the pillows, the only proof he'd been there at all. When he was home, his mind was elsewhere, his gaze fixed on his phone, a small, tight smile playing on his lips as he texted. "Just work, my love," he'd murmur, kissing her forehead. "This merger with Sterling Finch is a monster. It needs my full attention." She had believed him. She was a supportive wife, a partner. She understood pressure. But then came the small, sharp cuts of suspicion. A hushed phone call he took on the balcony in the rain. The scent of a perfume, not hers. Something younger, sweeter on a suit jacket, back from the dry cleaner. A sudden password change on his personal laptop. Each one was a tiny paper cut, insignificant on its own. But together they were beginning to bleed. The truth, when it came, wasn't delivered in a dramatic confrontation. It arrived in a crisp, cream-colored envelope from their private bank, a place as discreet and formidable as a Swiss fortress. It was a quarterly statement for a credit card she didn't know existed. a black card exclusive and unlimited under a subsidiary of his company. Her hands trembled as she scanned the itemized list. There were the usual charges for a man like Damien: 5-figure dinners at restaurants she'd never heard of, last-minute flights to cities not on his itinerary. But one recurring charge made her breath catch in her throat. A monthly payment of £25,000 to a property management company for a flat in Knightsbridge. An extravagant, obscene amount for a rental. With a surge of adrenaline that eclipsed her physical pain, Isabella opened her laptop. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, her mind a flurry of fear and focus. She still had access to some of their shared financial portals, an oversight Damien, in his arrogance, had probably forgotten. She cross-referenced the property company, found the address, and then, using a private investigator service she paid for with her own family money, she requested the name on the lease agreement. The report came back in less than an hour. The file name was a simple string of numbers. She clicked, and the world tilted on its axis. The flat at 21A Cadogan Square was leased to one S. Rossi. S. Rossi. It couldn't be. A coincidence. A cruel cosmic joke. There were other Rossis in the world. But Isabella knew. A cold, leaden certainty settled in her stomach, heavier than the baby she carried. She knew who S. Rossi was. Her sister, Serafina. Serafina with her bright, hungry eyes and her careless laughter. 10 years younger, always living in Isabella's shadow, always striving, competing, wanting what Isabella had. She'd always called Isabella Bella, but the nickname had started to sound less like affection and more like a taunt. Serafina had just graduated with a business degree, and through Damien's influence had secured a coveted internship at Sterling Finch, the very company Damien was trying to acquire. She was in London, just a few miles away. The pieces clicked into place with the sickening finality of a coffin lid shutting. The late nights, the secret calls, the sweet perfume. Serafina's recent windfall flaunted on Instagram with new designer bags and shoes she couldn't possibly afford on an intern's salary. Isabella felt a wave of nausea so profound she thought she might pass out. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was a desecration. Damien hadn't just cheated on his pregnant wife. He had chosen the one person in the world who would inflict the maximum possible pain. Her own blood. Her little sister. The pain in her back flared again, a searing, white-hot agony that shot down her legs. Her doctor's words echoed in her ears. "Any undue stress, Isabella. We need to keep you calm. The baby's position is precarious." Calm. How could she be calm? Her entire life was a lie. Her marriage a sham. Her family a viper's nest. The man she loved and the sister she had raised like a daughter were laughing at her behind her back, living a parallel life funded by her husband's treachery. Something inside her snapped. The quiet, graceful Isabella Rossi Blackwood, the queen of the gilded cage, ceased to exist. In her place was a woman forged in the fires of absolute betrayal. A woman with nothing left to lose. She knew Damien's schedule. He had sent it to her that morning, a token gesture of a normal husband. Today was the final negotiation, the culmination of his 6-month obsession. He was at the Shard on the 72nd floor in the Blackwood Industries boardroom they called Olympus, closing the Sterling Finch merger, a £50 billion deal, the pinnacle of his career. And she knew with a chilling certainty that Serafina would be there. As an intern for the opposing side, she'd be in the room taking notes, a silent, triumphant witness to her lover's victory. Isabella stood up, the pain a distant echo to the roaring in her ears. She walked to her wardrobe, past the rows of Birkin bags and Louboutin heels. She didn't choose a power suit or a statement dress. She pulled on a simple cream-colored cashmere maternity dress, the one Damien had said made her look like an angel. She slipped on a pair of flat, sensible shoes. She didn't bother with makeup. The pallor of her skin and the dark circles under her eyes would be part of her message. Her driver, a stoic man named Arthur, who had been with her for years, was waiting downstairs. "The Shard, Arthur," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "And please hurry." Arthur's eyes met hers in the rearview mirror, a flicker of concern in their depths. He had seen her through every mood, but he had never seen this terrifying calm. He simply nodded and pulled the Bentley into the London traffic. The ride was a blur. Isabella's hand rested on her swollen belly, not just to soothe the child within, but to anchor herself to reality. This was real. This was happening. The baby kicked a small, fluttering movement, and for the first time tears welled in Isabella's eyes. Not of sadness, but of rage. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about her son. He would not be born into a world built on lies. He would not have a father who was a cheat and an aunt who was a whore. When they arrived, the lobby of the Shard was a cathedral of corporate power. Men and women in sharp suits moved with quiet purpose. The air hummed with money and ambition. The receptionist at the Blackwood Industries desk, a young woman with a headset and a permanently polite smile, looked up. "Mrs. Blackwood." "How lovely to see you. I'm afraid Mr. Blackwood is in a very important meeting," and left strict. "I know." Isabella cut her off, her voice like ice. "I'm expected." She didn't wait for a response. She walked directly to the executive elevators, the ones that required a special key card. She still had hers. Another oversight. She swiped, and the doors slid open with a silent hiss. As the elevator ascended, the city of London unfolding beneath her, a strange sense of peace settled over her. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. She was no longer a victim. She was a consequence. The elevator opened onto the 72nd floor. The air was different up here, thinner, charged with power. Damien's executive assistant, a notoriously unflappable woman named Claire, stood guard outside a set of imposing frosted glass doors. Her eyes widened in panic when she saw Isabella. "Isabella, my God, is everything all right?" "You shouldn't be here. He's in the final stages." "Get out of my way, Claire," Isabella said, her voice low and dangerous. "I can't. My job? He'll have my head," Claire stammered, physically blocking the door. Isabella looked at the terrified woman. A flicker of the old her, the compassionate, her feeling a pang of pity. But it was quickly extinguished. "He can have your head," Isabella said, placing her hand on the door. "I'm here for his soul." She pushed. Claire stumbled back, and Isabella shoved the heavy glass doors open. The sound of them banging against the stoppers echoed through the cavernous boardroom. 20 pairs of the most powerful eyes in international finance turned to stare at her. The room was silent, the tension thick enough to suffocate. At the head of a long obsidian table sat Damien. His face, a moment ago alight with triumph, was now a mask of disbelief and fury. Seated around the table were the stony-faced executives of Sterling Finch, their lawyers, their bankers. And there, sitting slightly behind the CEO of Sterling Finch, clutching a pen and a notepad, was Serafina. Her face went white as a sheet. Her mouth fell open. Her beautiful, treacherous eyes met Isabella's across the room, and in them Isabella saw everything. Guilt, fear, and the pathetic, fleeting thrill of a victory that had just turned to ash. Damien was the first to recover. He stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the marble floor. His voice was a low growl meant only for her, but in the dead silence of the room, everyone heard it. "Isabella, what in God's name do you think you're doing? This is a £50 billion deal. Get out!" Isabella walked slowly, deliberately into the center of the room. Her hand never left her stomach. She ignored the shocked faces, the whispered condemnations. She had an audience of the most influential people in her husband's world. It was perfect. She looked directly at her husband, a man she no longer recognized. £50 billion, she said, her voice clear and steady, resonating with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "That's a lot of money, Damien. Is that what it costs to buy a new life?" "This is not the time or the place," he hissed, his eyes darting towards his business partners, a desperate plea for them to ignore the unfolding drama. "Oh, I think it is the perfect time." Isabella countered, her gaze sweeping the room before landing back on him. "This is a meeting about the future, isn't it? About mergers and partnerships, about trust and loyalty, vows of a sort." She took another step closer. "Well, I'm here to talk about the vows you made to me, in a church, before God." The Sterling Finch executives were now looking at each other, their expressions shifting from shock to alarm. This was no mere domestic dispute. This was a public implosion. "Isabella, you're hysterical," Damien said, trying to seize control. "Your condition, my condition," she laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "My condition is that I am pregnant with your son, and my condition is that I have just discovered my husband, the great Damien Blackwood, has been sleeping with another woman." A collective gasp went through the room. Damien's face turned a shade of purple. He looked like he was about to explode. "But it gets better," Isabella continued, her voice rising. She turned slowly and pointed a trembling finger directly at her sister. Serafina shrank back in her chair as if she had been physically struck. "You see, gentleman, Damien is a man of convenience. Why go looking for a mistress when you can just take one from your own family?" she announced to the stunned audience. "Allow me to introduce the other woman, the intern you all so graciously welcomed into your company, my younger sister, Serafina Rossi." Silence. Absolute, profound, world-ending silence. Every eye in the room swiveled from Isabella to Damien, and finally to the mortified, weeping girl at the end of the table. Isabella held her sister's gaze, the last vestiges of love and sisterhood, dying in that moment. She had done it. She had detonated the bomb in the center of her husband's universe. As the shockwave rippled through the room, a sharp, piercing pain, far worse than anything before, shot through Isabella's abdomen. Her hand flew to her stomach. Her knees buckled, and a dark stain began to spread across the front of her cream-colored dress. The last thing she saw before the world faded to black was Damien's face, his mask of fury finally replaced by a look of genuine horror. For a frozen moment, the only sound in the boardroom on the 72nd floor was the ghost of Isabella's last pain-filled cry. The scene was a tableau of horror. The fallen woman, the spreading stain of blood on her dress, the billionaire frozen between his throne and his wife, and the circle of powerful men whose expressions had morphed from shock to cold, calculating assessment. Then chaos erupted. It was Damien who moved first. The mask of fury and shock was shattered, replaced by raw, primal fear. "Isabella!" he roared, lunging across the room, skidding to his knees beside her. "Somebody call an ambulance now!" His hands hovered uselessly over her body, afraid to touch her, to cause more harm. The blood was a stark, horrifying red against the pale cream of her dress. His executive assistant, Claire, already had her phone to her ear, her voice sharp and efficient, despite her trembling. "Yes. 72nd floor of the Shard. Woman down, pregnant, heavy bleeding, unconscious. Yes, hurry." The Sterling Finch executives, led by their silver-haired CEO Alistair Finch, began to gather their things with a chilling lack of emotion. Their lawyers were already whispering furiously to one another. This wasn't a personal tragedy to them. It was a material breach, an event of catastrophic instability. The £50 billion deal was already dead. They were just waiting for the coroner's report. Alistair Finch walked over to Damien, who was now cradling Isabella's head in his lap, murmuring her name over and over. "Blackwood," Alistair said, his voice like gravel. "This meeting is over. Our offer is rescinded. You'll hear from our legal team." He didn't offer a word of sympathy. He simply turned and walked away, his entourage flowing out of the room behind him like a retreating tide. Damien barely registered his departure. His entire world had narrowed to his wife's pale face and the terrifying reality of the blood seeping into the knees of his £1,000 suit. Across the room, Serafina was a statue of shame. The eyes of the few remaining Blackwood Industries staff were on her, burning with contempt. She was no longer the brilliant intern or the billionaire's beautiful conquest. She was a home wrecker, a viper, the cause of all this destruction. With a choked sob, she grabbed her purse and fled, pushing past a junior executive who didn't even bother to move out of her way. She ran for the elevator, her heels clicking a frantic, panicked rhythm on the marble floor, escaping the wreckage she had helped create. The paramedics arrived with stunning speed, a whirlwind of calm professionalism in the storm of panic. They swarmed around Isabella, their voices a low, steady stream of medical jargon. "Placental abruption, most likely. Lost a lot of blood. Get her on the gurney. Let's move." Damien was pushed aside, a helpless bystander. As they wheeled Isabella out, her hand slipped from the gurney, her 5-carat diamond ring glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. A symbol of a promise now broken, a future now erased. He stumbled after them, his mind a maelstrom of guilt and terror. He had done this. His lies, his arrogance, his betrayal had physically struck her down. The pristine white walls of the private Lindo wing at St. Mary's Hospital felt like a prison. For hours, Damien paced the corridor outside the operating theatre, his clothes still stained with his wife's blood. He ignored the calls lighting up his phone, his CFO, his PR team, his lawyers. The £50 billion deal he had obsessed over for months was now just meaningless noise. The first person he couldn't ignore was Marco Rossi. Isabella's father arrived not with a flurry of emotion, but with a heavy, dangerous silence. He was a man who carried the weight of generations of Italian power in his bearing. He was shorter than Damien, older, but he radiated an authority that made the billionaire feel like an insolent child. He was flanked by his wife Elena, a woman of impossible elegance, whose face was a mask of grief-stricken fury. Marco walked directly up to Damien, stopping inches from his face. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "You did this," he said, his voice low, each word a chip of ice. "My daughter, my grandchild. If they do not survive, there is no corner of this earth where you will be able to hide from me." "Marco, Damien started, but the words died in his throat. What could he say? "I'm sorry." The words were a pathetic insult to the magnitude of his crime. Elena slapped him. The sound cracked through the sterile quiet of the hallway. It wasn't a hysterical act, but a deliberate, precise strike delivered with all the force of a mother's righteous anger. "You will not speak to my husband," she spat, her eyes blazing. "You will not speak to anyone. You will stand there and you will pray to a God you do not believe in that you have not killed my family." Damien took the hit, the sting on his cheek, a faint echo of the agony in his soul. He retreated, leaning against the opposite wall, a pariah in the unfolding tragedy of his own making. Hours later, a surgeon, her face grim and tired, emerged from the operating theatre. "Mr. Blackwood, Mr. and Mrs. Rossi." All three rushed forward. "My daughter," Marco demanded. "Isabella is stable for now," the surgeon said carefully. "She lost a significant amount of blood. The placental abruption was severe, triggered by acute emotional and physical distress. We had to perform an emergency cesarean section." Damien felt a dizzying wave of relief, so potent it almost buckled his knees. "And the baby, my son." The surgeon's expression tightened. "Your son was born at just 28 weeks. He is alive, but he is in critical condition. His lungs are severely underdeveloped. He's in the neonatal intensive care unit. We are doing everything we can, but I must be frank with you. The next 48 hours are crucial. You should prepare yourselves." The words hung in the air, a death sentence wrapped in medical terminology. Prepare yourselves. Elena Rossi let out a strangled sob, collapsing into her husband's arms. Damien felt the last of his strength drain away. His son. A tiny, fragile life, fighting for breath because of him. The news of the boardroom implosion and Isabella's collapse spread through the financial world like a virus. By morning, it was on the cover of every newspaper and the lead story on every news channel. Blackwood meltdown, billion-pound deal dies in sex scandal. The sister, the wife, and the tycoon. His picture was everywhere, next to a smiling photograph of Isabella and a grainy, long-lens shot of Serafina fleeing the Shard. His company's stock plummeted. Investors were panicking. The board was calling for an emergency meeting to discuss his future as CEO. The empire he had built with such ruthless precision was crumbling, its foundations rotted by his own moral decay. In her Knightsbridge flat, a gilded cage she now understood was paid for by her sister's tears. Serafina watched the news, her body numb with shock. A formal email had already arrived from Sterling Finch, terminating her internship for gross misconduct and behavior, bringing the company into disrepute. She tried calling Damien, but his phone went straight to voicemail. She texted a desperate stream of apologies and questions. No reply. He had used her, and now that she was no longer a thrilling secret, but a public liability, he had discarded her. The silence from him was more damning than any angry words could ever be. She was utterly, completely alone. 2 days later, Isabella woke up. The first thing she felt was an overwhelming emptiness in her womb. The weight, the life that had been a constant presence for 7 months was gone. Panic seized her. "My baby," she whispered, her voice raspy. Her mother was at her side, instantly stroking her hair. "Shh, Cara. He is fighting." "Your son is a fighter like his mother." They explained everything. The emergency surgery, the NICU, the terrifying, precarious balance of his life. Later that day, they wheeled her to the neonatal unit. The room was filled with the soft beeping and whirring of machines that sustained life. And there, in a small plastic incubator, was her son. He was impossibly small, his skin translucent, a tangle of wires and tubes connecting him to the machinery that breathed and ate and lived for him. Damien stood on the other side of the incubator. He looked like a ghost. His eyes hollowed out, his face unshaven. He hadn't left the hospital. Their eyes met over the fragile body of their son. There was no anger left in Isabella, no rage, just a vast, cold emptiness. "Does he have a name?" Damien asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Alessandro," she replied, her gaze fixed on the baby. "After my grandfather. A good, strong man." The implication was clear. Everything Damien was not. She watched her son's tiny chest rise and fall with the help of a ventilator. Every beep of the machine was a countdown. In that moment, watching the life she had created flicker so precariously, a new kind of strength, cold and hard as steel, began to form in her heart. She looked at Damien. "Get out," she said. "Isabella, please. I will not have you here," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I will not have your poison in this room. My son is fighting for his life because of you. He will not do it with you in his sight." He flinched as if she had struck him again. He looked from her to their son, and the fight seemed to go out of him. He nodded a broken, defeated gesture and walked out of the NICU, leaving the family he had shattered to stand vigil. Later that evening, her father came into her private room. "He is gone," Marco said. Isabella nodded, her eyes fixed on the London skyline outside her window. "Father," she said, her voice clear and without a trace of weakness. "Call my lawyer." "Call your lawyer. Call every lawyer we know. I don't want a divorce. I want a war. I want to ruin him. I want to take everything. His company, his reputation, his name. I want him to know what it feels like to have his entire world burn. For Alessandro. For my son." Marco Rossi looked at his daughter, and for the first time in days, he smiled. It was a grim, predatory smile. He saw that the fire of betrayal had not destroyed her. It had forged her into a weapon. "As you wish, mia cara," he said. "The war has already begun." Isabella's private hospital suite was transformed. The scent of lilies and antiseptic was replaced by the sharp electric hum of ambition and revenge. What was once a recovery room became a war room. Laptops and files covered every surface, and the quiet murmur of her mother's prayers was supplanted by the clipped, precise tones of lawyers speaking in millions and billions. At the center of this new web was Fiona Davenport, the woman the London elite called the Shark, and whispered about in the same terrified tones they used for market crashes and tax audits. Fiona was a legend in the world of high-stakes divorce. She didn't just win cases, she dismantled empires. With sleek silver hair cut in a severe bob, and eyes that saw everything as a line item on a balance sheet, she exuded a competence that was both terrifying and deeply comforting. "A war is messy, Isabella," Fiona said, her voice smooth as silk, but with an edge of steel. She sat opposite Isabella, who was propped up in her hospital bed, looking more like a monarch holding court than a patient. "A war is expensive, and it is public. Are you certain this is the path you want?" "He put my son's life in jeopardy," Isabella replied, her voice cold. Her gaze drifted to a digital photo frame on her bedside table, cycling through pictures of Alessandro in his incubator, a tiny, frail warrior. He built an empire on lies. I want it taken apart, piece by piece, until he has nothing left but the rubble. Is that clear? Fiona allowed herself a thin, predatory smile. Crystal. The strategy session was brutal and efficient. Marco Rossi, using his vast network, had already compiled a dossier on Damien that would make an intelligence agency blush. Hidden accounts, shell corporations, discreet investments from Monaco to the Cayman Islands. He had built his kingdom with brilliant, often ruthless legal acrobatics. "He's over-leveraged," Fiona noted, tapping a manicured nail on a financial statement. "The failure of the Sterling Finch deal has triggered covenants on 3 major loans. The stock drop has wiped out billions in his personal equity. He's vulnerable, but he's also a cornered animal, and that's when they're most dangerous." "What is our first move?" Marco asked, his presence a heavy, intimidating force in the room. "We don't go for the divorce papers first." "That's what he'll expect," Fiona explained. "We go for the jugular. We file an emergency injunction to freeze his assets. All of them. Personal, corporate, everything we can touch. We'll argue that his reckless personal behavior has proven him to be a danger to the marital estate. His affair wasn't just an affair. It was a financial liability that cost his company, and by extension, Isabella a £50 billion opportunity. We argue that he cannot be trusted to manage his own finances, let alone hers and their sons." It was an audacious, savage move. It would effectively cripple Damien, locking him out of his own kingdom. "Do it," Isabella commanded without hesitation. Damien Blackwood felt like a ghost haunting his own life. The board of Blackwood Industries, in a tense video conference he took from a sterile hotel room, had politely but firmly insisted he take an indefinite leave of absence. His keycard to the Shard was deactivated. His corporate accounts were suspended. He who had once commanded legions couldn't even order office supplies. He spent his days in a torment of helplessness. He would go to the hospital only to be met at the entrance to the Lindo wing by a security guard hired by the Rossi family, who would politely inform him that he was not welcome. He could only get updates on his son's condition through a nurse who would give him curt clinical reports. He had a good night. His oxygen saturation is stable. The doctors are cautiously optimistic. Cautiously optimistic. The words were a lifeline and a torture. He yearned to see his son to stand by his incubator to somehow will strength into his tiny body. But he was barred an echo from his own child's fight for life. The guilt was a physical presence, a weight on his chest that made it hard to breathe. He would sit in the hospital cafeteria for hours, drinking bitter coffee just to be in the same building as his son. His nights were a blur of whiskey and sleeplessness. The news reports a constant jeering chorus of his downfall. He saw pictures of his wife, pale but resolute, leaving the hospital, her father a protective shield at her side. He saw financial pundits dissecting his company's collapse. He saw his legacy turning to dust. It was during one of these bleak, anonymous afternoons in the cafeteria that his phone buzzed. It was his lawyer. "Damien, you need to sit down." "I'm sitting." "You've just been served. It's an injunction from Isabella's counsel. They've frozen everything. Your bank accounts, your trading portfolios, your access to company credit. As of right now, you can't even buy a cup of coffee." Damien looked at the half-empty paper cup on his table. The world tilted. He had been worth billions of pounds yesterday. Today he was functionally bankrupt. It was a masterstroke of legal violence, so swift and total it took his breath away. It had Fiona Davenport's fingerprints all over it. This wasn't a divorce. This was an execution. In the Knightsbridge flat, the silence was deafening for Serafina. The money from Damien had stopped. The rent was due. The eviction notices had started. Her so-called friends had vanished, their calls going unanswered. She was a social leper, the Scarlet Woman in London's biggest scandal. Shame was a corrosive acid, But fear was a more powerful motivator. She had been a fool, a pawn in a game she hadn't understood. She had been dazzled by Damien's power, by the thrill of being chosen, of finally eclipsing her perfect older sister. Now she saw the truth. He had never seen her. He had only seen a convenience, a conquest, a secret thrill. She followed the news obsessively. She saw Isabella's strength, her father's power, and Damien's public ruin. And a new feeling began to crystallize amidst the shame and fear, a sliver of Rossi loyalty she thought she had long since buried. She had helped this monster. She had betrayed her own blood for him. And she knew something. During her final weeks at Sterling Finch privy to the due diligence documents for the merger, she had stumbled upon something odd. A series of planned asset transfers, scheduled for the day after the merger was to be completed. It looked to her admittedly inexperienced eye like Damien was planning to use the newly acquired Sterling Finch assets as collateral to finance a series of high-risk personal ventures, effectively looting the company before the ink was even dry. At the time, she'd been too infatuated to question it. It was just Damien being brilliant, moving money in ways she couldn't comprehend. Now she saw it for what it was: fraud. It was a weapon, a devastating one. Maybe, just maybe, it was a path to some kind of redemption, or at least a way out of the hell she was in. She couldn't call Isabella. The number was blocked. She couldn't call her father. She knew he would hang up on her if he didn't curse her first. There was only one person left, the one person whose love for Isabella might just override her hatred for Serafina, her mother. With trembling hands, Serafina composed a text message to Elena Rossi. "Mama, I know you hate me, and you have every right. I have done a monstrous thing, but I know something about Damien, something that can help Isabella destroy him for good. It's proof. Criminal proof. Please, Mama, let me help. For Bella." She sent the message into the void, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was a Hail Mary, a desperate plea from the abyss. In Isabella's new home, a fortress-like townhouse in Belgravia owned by her family, Elena Rossi's phone chimed. She saw the name Serafina, and her first instinct was to delete it, to block the number, to erase her younger daughter from existence. The betrayal was too raw, too deep. But the words on the screen stopped her. Criminal proof. Elena's mind raced. Isabella's war was righteous, but it was still a civil matter. It would be a long, ugly public battle. But if there was evidence of criminality, that changed the entire game. That wasn't just divorce. It was prison. It wasn't just ruin. It was annihilation. She looked at Isabella, who was on a conference call with her legal team, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. She was so strong, but Elena knew the toll this was taking. And then she thought of Alessandro, her tiny grandson, still fighting in his plastic box. Hatred for Serafina was a flaw in her heart. But love for Isabella was the sun. Torn. Elena walked out onto the terrace overlooking the quiet garden square. She forwarded the text message to one person, her husband. She added a single line of her own. "Marco, what do we do?" The reply from her husband came back in less than a minute. It was not what she expected. Listen to her. The meeting took place in a location stripped of all warmth and sentiment, a glass-walled conference room in Fiona Davenport's law firm, a space that felt less like a room and more like an operating theatre. The air was cold, the silence clinical. It was neutral ground, chosen to prevent the volatile emotions of the Rossi family home from contaminating the proceedings. Isabella sat at the head of the long, polished table, a queen in exile. The fire of her initial rage had cooled into something far more dangerous, a core of pure, unyielding ice. Beside her sat her father Marco, his presence a silent, looming promise of retribution. Fiona Davenport stood by the window, observing her sharp eyes, missing nothing. Elena had refused to come. The thought of being in the same room as her younger daughter was still too painful. Serafina was led in by a junior associate. She looked like a ghost of her former self. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by a simple, ill-fitting black dress. Her face was pale and puffy from crying, her usual vibrant energy extinguished. She clutched a worn leather handbag to her chest, as if it were a shield. She didn't dare look at Isabella, her eyes fixed on a point on the floor. "You have something for us?" Fiona said, breaking the silence. Her tone was not unkind, but it held no room for pleasantries. With trembling hands, Serafina opened her handbag and pulled out a small silver thumb drive. She slid it across the polished table. It stopped inches from Isabella's hand. "Everything is on there," Serafina whispered, her voice cracking. "Internal memos from Sterling Finch's servers, drafts of the post-merger integration plan, and Damien's private financial projections. I copied them from a folder he left open on his laptop one night at the flat." Fiona picked up the drive and inserted it into her laptop. As she clicked through the files, her expression remained impassive, but a glint of triumph appeared in her eyes. Marco leaned in to look, his own face hardening with each document that appeared on the screen. It was all there, laid out in black and white. A meticulous, predatory plan. Damien intended to use Sterling Finch's sterling reputation and considerable cash reserves as a launch pad. He would leverage their assets to the hilt, funneling the money into a series of incredibly high-risk, speculative ventures under shell corporations that traced back only to him. If they paid off, he would become astronomically wealthy. If they failed, the newly acquired Sterling Finch and all its employees and legacy shareholders would be left with the debt, and Blackwood Industries would be insulated from the fallout. "It's not just asset stripping," Marco murmured, his voice tight with fury. "It's a bust-out, a gangster's move. He was going to gut the company like a fish." Fiona nodded slowly. "This is more than we could have hoped for. It's premeditated, systematic fraud. This isn't a divorce case anymore. This is a matter for the serious fraud office. This is prison time, Damien." Isabella stared at the thumb drive, the small piece of silver that held her husband's doom. All this power, all this destruction delivered by the hand of the sister who had betrayed her. It felt vile, tainted. "Why?" Isabella asked, her voice quiet, but carrying across the silent room. It was the first time she had spoken directly to Serafina. Serafina finally looked up, her eyes swimming with tears. "At first I did it because I was scared," she admitted, her voice trembling. "He cut me off. The eviction notices. I had nowhere to go. I thought maybe this would make you help me." She took a shaky breath. "But then, I kept watching the news. I saw what he did to you, to the baby. I saw his face. He didn't care about any of it. About me, about you. We were just things to him. Objects. And I realized. I helped him. I stood by and I let him hurt you. I let him hurt my own nephew. I can never take that back, Bella. I know that. But I couldn't let him get away with it. I couldn't let him win." The use of her childhood nickname, Bella, was a small, sharp pain in Isabella's heart. You expect me to believe you? Isabella asked, her voice laced with ice. You expect me to trust you? No, Serafina said, shaking her head. A fresh wave of tears spilling down her cheeks. I don't expect anything. You can take this and tell me to go to hell. I deserve it. But it's the truth, and it's the only thing I have left to give you. There was a long silence. Isabella's mind was a battleground. To use this evidence would be to win. Utterly. To not just divorce Damien, but to annihilate him just as she had wanted. But it meant accepting help from Serafina. It meant forming an unholy alliance with her own betrayer. It felt like a compromise of her own integrity, a stain on her righteous anger. Marco placed a hand on his daughter's arm. Isabella, he said gently, a snake is a snake, but sometimes its venom is the only antidote. Damien was unraveling. The asset freeze was absolute. He had been forced to move into a soulless corporate hotel, the bill being covered by the one company credit card his lawyers had managed to unfreeze for essential living expenses. He had tried to fight the injunction, but with the public evidence of his affair directly leading to the collapse of a multi-billion-pound deal, the judge had upheld it without a second thought. Desperation was a new and terrifying feeling for him. He had always been in control, always 3 steps ahead. Now he was trapped powerless, watching his life's work be dissected by analysts on television. He started sending messages not to Isabella's lawyers, but to her mother, to old family friends, to anyone he thought might get a message to her. They were pathetic, pleading texts, a mix of apology and threat. Tell her I'm sorry. I was a fool. I love her. She's destroying our family. Does she want our son to visit his father in a homeless shelter? Remember that weekend in Tuscany? Before all this. We can have that again, Bella. Just talk to me. The messages were forwarded to Isabella. She read them with a cold, detached curiosity, as if studying a dead insect under glass. The man who wrote these words was a stranger to her now. That evening, Isabella went to the hospital. Alessandro had had a good day. He had gained a few ounces. He was breathing more and more on his own. The doctor said he was a fighter. She stood over his incubator, her hand placed gently on the plastic as close as she could get. She looked at his tiny face, his impossibly small fingers curled into a fist. He was fighting so hard. He was fighting against the damage his own father had inflicted before he had even taken his first breath. And in that moment, all of Isabella's internal conflict vanished. Her war wasn't about her pride. It wasn't about her broken heart or her sister's betrayal. It was about this child. It was about ensuring that the man who had so recklessly endangered him would never have the power to harm anyone ever again. Justice, no matter the source, was the only thing that mattered. She pulled out her phone and sent a short text to Fiona Davenport. Use it. Burn him to the ground. The day Fiona Davenport anonymously delivered the thumb drive to the Serious Fraud Office was the day the war ended and the slaughter began. It happened quietly at first, a few discreet inquiries, then a dawn raid. News crews tipped off by an anonymous source, likely from Marco Rossi's extensive network, captured the footage. Damien Blackwood, haggard and unshaven in his sad hotel bathrobe, was led out in handcuffs. The humiliation was total broadcast in high definition across the globe. The titan of industry looked like what he was, a common criminal. The charges were extensive and damning: conspiracy to defraud, fraudulent trading, and multiple counts of false accounting. The evidence from the thumb drive was ironclad. Serafina, granted immunity in exchange for her testimony, became the prosecution's star witness. Her appearance in court was a painful ordeal. She detailed Damien's manipulations and her own willing complicity with a quiet, devastating honesty, never once looking at Isabella, who watched from the public gallery, her face an unreadable mask. Damien's trial was swift. Stripped of his wealth and power, he was a hollow man, his arrogance replaced by a pathetic bewilderment. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Blackwood Industries was dismantled by liquidators, its assets sold off for parts to pay its colossal debts. The empire built on ambition and ruthlessness had vanished, leaving nothing but a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms. Through it all, Isabella focused on the one thing that mattered. Alessandro came home from the hospital 3 months after his chaotic birth. He was still small, but he was healthy, a miracle of resilience. The Belgravia townhouse, once a war room, filled with the sounds of a baby's laughter. The silence in Isabella's heart began to recede. One crisp autumn afternoon, about a year after Damien's sentencing, Serafina appeared at the door. She wasn't summoned. She came on her own. She looked healthier, having found a quiet administrative job, living a simple, anonymous life. Isabella let her in. They sat in the formal living room, an awkward silence stretching between them. "I'm leaving London," Serafina finally said. "I'm moving to Manchester. A new start, where no one knows my name." "I see," Isabella said, her voice neutral. I know, sorry, will never be enough," Serafina stammered. "And I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just wanted to see him, once, before I go." Isabella was quiet for a long moment. She looked at her sister, not the viper who had shared her husband's bed, but a broken woman trying to piece her life back together. She thought of the evidence, the testimony, the role Serafina had played in securing justice for her and her son. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was something. Without a word, Isabella stood and led her upstairs to the nursery. Alessandro was asleep in his crib, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. He had his mother's dark hair, and even in sleep, a look of peaceful determination. Serafina looked at him, and her carefully constructed composure shattered. A silent orb escaped her tears, streaming down her face. It was the grief of all she had done, all she had lost, all the innocence she had destroyed embodied in the tiny, perfect child before her. "He's beautiful, Bella," she whispered through her tears. Isabella nodded. "Yes, he is." They stood there for a few minutes, two sisters bound by blood and betrayal, finding a fragile, unspoken truce over a cradle. After Serafina left, Isabella picked up her son. She looked out the window at the London skyline, the city that had been the backdrop for her fairy tale life, and its spectacular implosion. She was no longer Mrs. Blackwood, the billionaire's wife. She was Isabella Rossi, mother to Alessandro, and the sole inheritor of the ruins of an empire. Her lawyers had managed to claw back a significant fortune from Damien's less tainted assets, enough to ensure she and Alessandro would be comfortable for 100 lifetimes. She had no interest in rebuilding Blackwood Industries. Instead, she had established a foundation, the Alessandro Rossi Foundation, dedicated to funding neonatal research and providing support for families of premature infants. She had been forged in fire, and she had not been consumed. She had emerged stronger, harder, and infinitely wiser. The gilded cage was gone, and in its place was a life she was building herself on her own terms for her son. The pain of the past was a scar, but it was a part of her now, a reminder not of what she had lost, but of how hard she had fought to survive. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the garden, but for Isabella and her son, it felt like the dawn. The silence in that boardroom was the sound of a life shattering. Isabella risked everything to expose the truth, but it may have cost her the one thing she was fighting for her child. Damien's empire is on the brink, and the family betrayal has been laid bare for the world to see. What happens next? Does Damien try to save his deal or his wife? Can Serafina ever come back from a betrayal this deep? And most importantly, will Isabella and her baby survive? The story is far from over. This was just the beginning. If you were captivated by this story and need to know what happens next, let me know in the comments. What do you think Isabella should do if she wakes up? What would you do in her shoes? Your theories and thoughts fuel this series. Make sure you like this video. Share it with friends who love intense drama, and most importantly, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Part 2 will delve into the immediate chaotic aftermath, and trust me, you do not want to miss it.